Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Steve Burns with Crawford Software, and today we'll be sharing some best practices for upgrading to Epicor ERP 10. I'm joined by our founder and president, Steve Carr.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending. Hopefully you'll find this a useful and informative webinar.
Steve will be taking us through some best practices, as well as showing you some of the tools that Crawford Software uses in managing the upgrade process for our customers. It looks like there's still a few folks logging in, so what I'll do is start with one of two polls today to look at what your current Epicor environment is. And while you're taking a minute to fill that out, I did want to remind you that if you'd like to ask a question, please send it to me through the chat room provided, and Steve will be fielding some questions at the end of today's session. I'll go ahead and close that poll. And maybe what we'll do is just take a quick share. It looks like half of the folks are running Epicor 10, half running Epicor 9. It's pretty interesting. Doesn't seem to appear to be any older Vantage or Vista users on the line today. Excellent. So let's begin with a little background. Crawford Software has been an Epicor partner since 2008, and we've helped dozens of customers upgrade to Epicor ERP 10. We've learned over the years that organization and end user involvement are two of the key factors to a successful upgrade. We work with customers every step of the way, from business process review to go live and post go live support. And a little bit on Steve Carr. Steve Carr's led this company since its inception in 2001, and not only runs the business, but also manages projects for customers and builds and manages all standard processes that we use. And on that note, I'll turn it over to Steve so that he can share some best practices as well as some of the tool sets that we use. Steve?
Thank you, Steve. It's like a Steve show here. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, this is Steve Carr. So I'm going to walk through, starting with the agenda, what the topics are, and just set the guidelines for it. I will try to be clear and go through everything at a good pace, and hopefully you'll be able to understand everything that I say. And at the end, hopefully we'll have time to open it up for some questions and answers from everybody. We have a little bit of extra time. Not sure about everyone else's schedule, but just so you know, if we do get close to the timer, we're not going to stop at exactly 1 o'clock. We do have a little extra time ourselves. So the agenda for today's discussion is starting with the Epicor ERP server environment. And that's also going to include the client installation, both the requirements and some baseline recommendations for the Epicor ERP 10 environment. Give a little bit of an overview on upgrading customizations and reports, what to expect, timing, some best practices and recommendations that we have for the process that we've used multiple times in different projects and have helped us have a very successful, very clean and very organized project with a smooth go live. Some notes about deploying the Epicor ERP 10 client to all the machines, and that's in the case that if you're not using a terminal server or some other emulation process for the clients to get in. A little bit of an overview on the testing strategy, and again, we'll show you some of the tools that we use as far as documenting and keeping track of the testing process and how we use that to get some user involvement and keep the project flowing. A little about the recommendations that we have had and success we've had on the conversion weekend, how we organize it, how we approach it, what we go through for that, and then wrapping up with justifying the upgrade. We'll talk about that at a general high level as far as the cost justification. That really becomes a unique situation by each company and each situation, whether you're coming from a Vantage, Vista, or 9, or just a simple 10 upgrade, something that's going from a 10.0 or a 10.1 to 10.1.6 is still considered a major upgrade when you're, depending on where you're coming from because of some outstanding items, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail as we go forward. So with that, we'll go ahead and start moving right into it, and let's talk about the Epicor ERP server environment and recommendations. So with a 10 environment, if you're not already there, we definitely do recommend the installation of a new server for hosting the ERP 10. There's a lot of reasons for that. The bigger ones are going to be that if you're coming from, in this case, I know we have some 9 people on the call. We don't have anyone from some of the Vantage Vistas, but in all cases, If you're coming from Vantage 8 or Vista, you're going to be removing the progress layer completely. If you're coming from 9, there are still some remnants of the progress infrastructure and layer that are there, and those will be removed. So starting with a clean system, installing the OS new, installing SQL Server new, you can get rid of anything that's left over from the progress, not have any hanging DLLs or things left over in the system, any conflicts due to Windows updates or anything else related to that. The other item that comes into play is Crystal Reports runtime, and whether or not you're going to be converting everything to SSRS or you're going to leave some things running on Crystal Reports. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail a little bit later on in the report, but in the webinar. But just to let you know that it is possible to run the Crystal Reports in the 10 environment, but not everything may work. So again, do not make a copy of your existing system, but set it up fresh and new OS, new SQL Server installation. The sizing recommendations, as most people might be aware of, are typically based on the number of users that you have logging onto the system. What's your module list? Do you have just the core functionality? Do you have any of the advanced modules, APM, advanced production planning, advanced quality? Do you have any of the third-party software solutions or things that require their own dedicated servers, such as Manifest or APM or any of the other applications that require their own dedicated activity? Continuing on that subject, for the hardware, high-level guidelines in a 10.1 environment would be Windows Server 2012, SQL Server 2012. The number of CPUs, the cores, and the processor speed is really going to come back to some of those other elements before. The number of applications you're using, the user count, the volume of reporting, and we have some more details that we can provide to people on recommendations there if you want to email us separately afterwards. For general guidelines, if you're looking at no more than 10 users, you can usually install everything on a single server. And that's going to include your SQL Server, your SSRS, and the application. When you start looking at 10 to 50 users, we would recommend and require a minimum of 2 servers. And that's because we want to have a physical separation between the application server and the database server. And we can still maintain on that database server the SSRS reporting services at the same time. And again, these are general guidelines. Over 50 users usually requires a minimum of 3 servers, one dedicated specifically for the reporting process, so the SSRS functionality moves onto a dedicated server at that time. Again, these are general guidelines. There's a lot of things that come into play, including, as I mentioned before, those third-party applications, APM, and different things, Manifest, and some of the other UPS and integration points. If you're using Service Connect on a heavy volume, talking to Salesforce or other things. So the Crawford system engineers are available here, or you can look to the Epicor sizing guide, which you can get from EpicWeb, to give you some general guidelines on that process. But we're more than happy to take a look at your landscape as far as understanding what your module list is and give you an answer in a few hours as far as what we would recommend for a standard setup. Moving on to the particular, in this, the OSs and the client. So these are the compatibilities that are approved from Epicor. So if you do go with a Windows 2008 R2, SQL Server 2008 R2, Windows Server 2012, SQL Server 2012, Server 2012, you can now, if you go with R2, you can move up to SQL Server 2014 or 2016 with 10.1.600, which is the most current release. That's general release right now. And of course, Windows Server 2016 would also work with SQL Server 2016. Epicor supports the browsers, the most recent versions of Chrome, Internet Explorer, Safari, Edge, Mozilla, and Firefox. We bring that up because at this time, we haven't found that we have a good compatibility running a native client on an Apple device, such as an iMac or a PowerBook. One thing that is important to note, if you are going with a version 10.1.500 or higher, is you will need to do a .NET 4.6.1 installation on each of the clients. And that process we have found to be a little bit tricky, depending on some of the machines and where they are as far as their Windows updates and different things. In typical what we've run into, there's a minimum of 5 patches, KB articles, that have to be applied from Microsoft. They have to be applied in a very specific order with a very specific reboot process in between to get your system up to the 4.6. And that's just from our own troubleshooting experience that we've run into this. You may not run into it. Either way, we have put the entire combination on a share file that we're willing to share with people, which will include links to all the KB articles and our notes as far as what we've done as far as having a successful installation of the KB articles, when we did the restarts, when we did all the application, and the order to put those KBs in place. One thing to note is that once you do that installation, your end client system can still work and talk to an Epicor 9, a Vantage, or a Vista, and it can also talk to your new 10.1.6 server at the same time. Where you would run into a situation that could be a potential problem is if for some reason you had to reinstall the legacy ERP client. So if you needed to reinstall the Epicor 9 client, you would actually have to bring the system back down to a 4.5. So you basically have to back out the 4.6, the KBs, and go through the process again, then re-upgrade it back to 4.6. Other than that, that's why we consider that one, and I think Epicor does also, a major upgrade, because there are the .NET installation there. All right. Continuing on, as far as the process related to the upgrade of customizations, reports, and forms. Obviously, if you're in an 8 system or a 9 system, everything's going to need to be reviewed. The database change is large when you go from Epicor 9 to Epicor 10 or Vantage and Vista to Epicor 10. Every customization, report, form, enhancement that has database references will need to be opened, reviewed, and updated as far as the new data dictionary and the new database definition. So if you've got a very large amount of customizations, a lot of custom reports, other things, interfaces, there can be a substantial amount of work just in man hours to go through that process to open every one of them and make the database changes. The other thing that's happening, as we talked about earlier, Crystal Reports is being replaced by SSRS, SQL Server Reporting Services, but Crystal will work, and some Crystal will work, I should say, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Just so we're all on the same page as far as what needs to be upgraded, every customization, as we mentioned, because the database changes, BPMs, method, and data directives will need to be updated, custom reports, BAQ, base data definitions, BAQs and external BAQs will have to be gone through. Dashboards will all have to be gone through. Any menu changes that you've created would have to possibly be updated for any new DLLs. The quick searches, extended UD tables, and you're also going to look at any of the interfaces you have using Service Connect or API connectors. So just in summary, there's a lot to look at as far as it just takes a lot of time to go through that process. When you're looking at it in more detail as deciding what to upgrade, we've always found the approach to bring this to a very organized one, and you'll see some of the log processes that we use going forward. Document all the items that require changes. So use the solution manager if you're on 9, use the customization maintenance if you're on 8 or one of the earlier releases, and pull a list, bring it together. Here's everything that I have. Identify it by category. Is it a customization? Is it a BPM? Is it a BAQ? And break it down. Also include inside of that an inventory of it by category. So we want to know, is this related to order management? Is it related to finance? Is it related to production planning? And we'll talk more about that in a second and why we do that. And then finally take some time to go through and compare that to the release notes. Or you can talk to us. We have a little more summarized version of the release notes than the very detailed technical one that Epicor provides. But you want to review it with the business team and look at, first, comparing it to the release notes, is there standard functionality? Has Epicor built something that is equal to or better than what you currently have and what you've customized and developed in your system, or you can replace it with standard functionality so that can be removed from the list, and it doesn't have to be brought forward, and it reduces cost, reduces effort, all the other pieces that go with it. Then go, and this is part of the reason why we're inventory by category, work with the business teams. Check and see, are they still being used? Is this a report that we created and it was for a situation 2 years ago where we had an audit and we don't need it anymore, and there's no reason to put the man hours or effort into bringing it up and upgrading it going forward. And then you want to prioritize the list based on the business need and criticality. What do I need for day one? What do I have to be able to go live? And what's available? I need it once a month. I need it at quarter end. I need it at year end. This is just going to help you identify that project timeline. Make sure you address the critical ones first, and we'll talk about it more a little bit later, but address those critical ones first and get them working, functioning, ready for user testing. And then we highly recommend working on the objects following your typical order to cash or procure to pay process. The reason we want to do that is if I get everything related to order management encapsulated in all of their customizations, their reports, their forms, any BPM triggers, anything else they have going, I can push that over to the unit testing area, start my unit testing and get it ready for user testing. And we want to be able to get the users involved in the project as soon as possible. So encapsulating allows me, instead of if I approach it from all customizations left to right across all area of functionality, you might be in a situation where we did have one customer that the original estimates that we did as far as upgrading the amount of forms, customizations, and everything they did, we had 4 people dedicated to that effort, and it was about 6 weeks because it was a very highly customized system. And we took this approach of going module and functionality area by area so we could start getting user involvement as soon as possible. You want them to be champions for the project. You want them to be looking at Epicor 10. You want them to be excited about the upgrade and seeing some of the new features and functionality that's there. Moving on. As we go further into more detail about the upgrade and customization, the reports and forms, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, standard Crystal reports will be replaced by SSRS reports starting in Epicor 10. Crystal reports can work, but there doesn't seem to be, at least not that we have found, a good rhyme or reason as to why some work and some don't. So if time is a concern, you want to get the project done on a shorter timeline, and you've got a heavily customized system, or cost is a concern and you want to eliminate that cost and address things a little bit later on, you can take the opportunity to upgrade those reports in the Crystal format. So it will be a manual process, and you have to upgrade them to the Epicor 10 Crystal report format, including things like the data dictionary changes and all those items. There's some time there, and it could be some time lost for items that don't work in 10.1, but you have an opportunity to greatly reduce the scope of what you need to do as far as customization and enhancements, mainly from that timeline perspective, to get the project done quicker, and then convert them into SSRS on a more, for lack of a better word, leisurely pace, and not have a direct cost impact to this timeline. For the SSRS, if you're going through that process, everything that you're doing as far as reports, dashboards, etc., they're going to have to be modified and recreated in the SSRS form. You have to start from scratch and rebuild it. That's where having a detailed documentation as far as what was done, how it was created, a functional design document, a functional specification really helped the process. For the conversion of the Crystal reports, it's again, you have to apply everything. Take it out of the Crystal, bring it in, recreate it in SSRS. Same comment. If it's been documented very well, or you have some starting point as far as a functional design or a functional specification, which is something we do for every customization enhancement that we do in the system, we always create a functional design document, which we pass to our customers as a Word so they can continue with it and go forward. But that starting point gives you a much easier transition than the developer looking through the code, looking through the Crystal, or looking through the report and trying to educatedly guess at what's been upgraded and what's been changed to try and match it. you're just going to have a much better success rate if you can do that. Definitely going to run into a case if it's not well documented, it's not very well, or not used very often, then obviously there's going to probably be a case where that timeline will go a little bit longer because you'll have a few iterations as they make the first pass, then the user comes back and says, well, this is missing or that is missing. All right. This is what we were talking about earlier as far as tracking for customizations. This is a section of one of the process tools that we use as far as monitoring a complete list of what's been done for the system. This is only the customizations. As I said, we break it up by category. So we have one table that's referencing all the customizations, another table for BPMs, another table for BAQs, and it's broken down in that level. All of them understand what module is there. So you start with, in the first area we're looking at, this is for customer entry. We identify the customization name. We have the complexity here. This is done by the developers with a quick look through the change itself to understand, is it a major piece of work, is it medium, or is it minor? And we have some baseline number of days that we can use based on experience having done these before, and that gets us a baseline for a time estimate. If we have 3 majors and 2 minors, we're probably looking at 12 days of effort or something like that to at least get a baseline for what we want to do as far as a project estimate. We keep track of the overall status right now. In this example, we have it set up for user testing. In all of our projects in the development system, which is that first stage after the developers have completed it, we run through a minimum of 2 testers. So one of our functional consultants will test it, and then a second functional consultant will test it. And that's just because there is so much work involved in an upgrade, particularly from a 9 or an 8, not so much from a 10 or a 10.0 or 10.1. But from an 8 or a 9, where we're basically almost recreating it, we want to make sure when we hand it to the user, we're as close to 100% as we can be for working the way they originally expected and what they thought. Moving on into the testing area. Testing is a very critical part of the process, and again, more so from one of the major upgrades, which would be a 10.0 to a 10.1.6, or an 8 or a 9, which would be considered a major upgrade because of those database changes that are going on. But it's also an opportunity during the testing process. We want to do more than just test the functionality. We don't want to just confirm the customizations, the enhancements, the reports, and everything are ready for going live on day one. Back to what we talked about earlier as far as encapsulating and working in single areas, we want to do that to get the user involvement sooner than later in the project. We've found from prior experience that if we have a project where the team is there for the kickoff meeting, they wait 3 weeks and don't do anything while we go ahead and upgrade every customization, every enhancement, do a database copy of production and make it as close to live as possible, it's hard to get them re-engaged. So from the time of the project kickoff, we want to have them involved on regular. We have regular updates on status calls, weekly at a minimum. We want to have them looking at the new system, logging in. We can check and monitor that. And then we want to get them things to test sooner than later so that they're participating in this. They start confirming and validating the need, the want to do the upgrade. They see the performance improvements. They see the new features. Maybe they notice the new search tools and other things that are going there. It also gives them time to update your business process documents and procedures. That should be done during the unit testing cycle. So if you have a business procedure for order entry, there are things that might change when you go to 10. Take that opportunity to update that Word document, add the new changes to it, add anything if it hasn't been updated in 3 or 4 years, anything new that's been added to the process, have them actively involved. And if you include screen prints in your documentation, have them add the new 10 screen prints so you're all set to go. And of course, the standard is always to confirm the customizations and they're going through it. You also want to make sure you're testing master data elements, not just transactional data. When you're moving from the Vantage Vista 9 up into 10, there are new data elements available. There are new screens available within transactions. There's new modules there. So you want to make sure that your testing scenario, and we'll show you one of our examples in a couple of slides here, includes master data elements. And the templates that we use and provide to our customers that are working with us for the upgrade, they include seed data, for lack of a better word, that has identified transactions we typically see that the customers notice, oh, there's new fields, and we try to point them out to them as they're going through that. But it is very key to start with transactional data and build yourself up from there. During the unit testing, so we always have a minimum of 2 different sets of testing. We have the unit testing, which is going to be testing that single business case scenario. So that's where you're creating a test case log, and you'll see that example in a little bit. This is something they can do even before the project really officially kicks off. And what do they do on a daily basis? They create sales orders that are domestic. They create international sales orders. They create drop shipments. And again, prioritize them as they're building that log and creating those test case scenarios of their daily activity. Unit testing is to test a single transaction, create a customer. Can I create a sales order? Can I add a part master? The bigger things that we always recommend as far as going through the process is make sure you document the test case requirement, that's what the logging is for, and the results. And you might augment that log with a test case scenario document that provides more detail. And again, update or even create the business procedure if you haven't started that process yet. And again, our customers, we provide some baseline Word documents that we have for part create, customer create. We have pretty much all of them in a standard baseline format that covers the basic fields, and it's something you can use to build and create that business procedure document library if you don't have it already. That unit testing should be completed and all the scenarios gone through, and then you're ready to go into the conference room pilot section. And if you have worked on an ERP implementation before, or for Epicor or your current employer or somewhere else, you've probably gone through that conference room pilot, but that's basically exactly what it sounds like. We're all sitting in one large conference room, working together, working through an order to cash or a procure to pay situation, and any other ones that you might do in a war room situation where customer service creates the order. They print the output, they validate the output, and then they hand it to the next person in the process. Is that person the production planner and running MRP, or is there another way to get notified that there's demand out there and a customer requirement? Again, same thing. We document what the test cases are. These can take a little bit longer to build up as far as the conference room pilot and laying them out step by step what you want to do. And you'll see one of our examples in the upcoming slide. During that conference room pilot, because this is happening near the end of the project, so you've basically validated everything works on a unit case. So we know the customer create process works. We know order entry works. We know our BPMs, our BAMs, our integration to Salesforce, and all these things are working on an individual basis. Now you're testing, does the whole flow work? And you've got that opportunity that while you're creating that issues log, you want to identify those items as, are they a showstopper, or are they a go live, no go type of situation? And those become the critical items that if it requires rework from the developer or whatever it is, you have to address those. Ideally, by this point in time, we have no showstoppers. We might have run into a couple of small form changes we need or small other things, but hopefully we have no showstoppers. During both cases, issue tracking and monitoring is critical. During the conference room pilot, we really like this model because we found in a lot of scenarios what we see is business units talking to business units, a customer service talking to production planning, and realizing gaps in the flow. And, oh, you were setting this flag on that sales order to indicate this, but production planning had no idea what you were doing with that. And those things come out and play. So use that time to create a business process flow if you don't have one, or update the one you have. That includes those notification processes. How does production planning know there's a new customer demand? Is it a manual process? Are they emailing each other? What are they doing? At least document it. And if it is just an email notification, flag it for business and process improvement for later on. During an upgrade of this type, especially coming from an older to a newer, a 9, 8 type of situation. You want to do as much as-is to as-is testing as possible. Introducing new functionality, things that aren't being used, just tends to cloud the waters as far as getting that validation and sign-off that I could create an order before the upgrade, and now we'll be able to create that exact same sales order with the same parts list, the same customer information, the same output document, the same pricing, all those wonderful things in 10. Adding new functionality, things you didn't do before, can just cloud that process. So we'll help you identify the new functionality and things you want to do, or you're noting them in the business process flow review or in the conference room pilot, but try to move them to a stage 2 or a phase 2 of the project, unless there's something there's a new tab on the part system that lets you enter inside diameters, outside diameters, things like that, and you were keeping them in Excel before. That's a pretty harmless one. Go ahead and implement that, and you can judge those as you go forward. The other thing to keep in mind for the conference room pilot process, use the 80-20 rule when you're going through that. You want to test the cases that are going to satisfy the majority of the business you expect to do on Monday when you go live. So picking on subcontracting, one of my favorite ones to pick on all the time when I do these types of discussions. If you don't use subcontracting except once or twice a year, document the scenario, have it laid out as a possible test case, but put it near the end. You want to do what's your bread and butter, what satisfies your customer orders, what generates revenue, what fulfills the business needs. Address those first. If you're make to stock and ship from inventory, do all the different iterations of those primarily first. Work the exceptions later on. It's going to be two things. One, you're going to get a user group that's very happy because those should all work and work well. They're not going to have a frustration point on the first day they go live. They're going to feel comfortable when you have the go, no-go meeting and decision-making time that it's good and we can do that. It also means that if there are problems, it should be in those lower volume transactions, those one-off transactions, so you can take some time and address it and not cripple the business or slow down the business to go forward. This is one of the test logs that we use as far as the testing, monitoring, and tracking. So we create the unit test log, which is just that summary here of create or change a part master as an example. We estimate how much time it's going to take the user to go through it. We keep track of when they started it, when they are, and what the current status is. This is what we're reviewing on a regular basis. This is part of our weekly calls with the entire team, the weekly status meeting if it's in the conference room, however you're doing it. We do flag anything we added as far as in this example here that we're looking at. Resources, scheduling wasn't part of their scope originally, and we added resource groups. It was a new requirement to start maintaining and using them. That's why we flagged it that way. The other thing you're seeing here is test case created. This is just following a document naming convention that is a Word document. We have templates for those that documents in full the test scenario. So create and change a part master. We have recommendations for the way to access it, what type of data you're trying to create, what you're trying to change. You might include screenshots of it. How much or how little, for lack of a better way to say it, you use in the test log, and whether or not you create that test case Word document, which is above and beyond, is really going to come down to your individual business needs inside of your company. Do you have requirements, be it ISO, be it FDA, be it TUV, anything like that that says you need a more thorough documentation process? It could even be your own internal quality team that requires a more thorough process than just a log that says, yep, Steve executed that test started on 7/1, finished it on 7/16, and said it passed. Some customers can have that and it's acceptable, others don't. Again, we have sample cases for both, depending on the level of requirements you have for your business needs. This is what we were talking about as far as a conference room pilot test log. And this one becomes a little more detailed because it's a step-by-step. And what we're trying to do in this is make sure we have all the attendees. Ideal situation, you'd love to have everybody in the room at the same time, working with the ebb and flow, and if it's sped up or slowed down, and just working through it. In reality, that's very hard to do, to basically bring one person from every department into a conference room for an entire day. So building this schedule out lets you identify when those people should be planning on joining you in the conference room if they can't be there for the duration, or a little bit before, a little bit after. You're also trying to track the data elements that were used in the process. So in this case, looking at the beginning of it, we're going into the customer master. We're just noting what they were, are they taxable, what their shipping process is, and then what their current value is as far as open credit. We're doing the same thing as far as looking at the part master, and this is just laying down the foundation so that when we create the sales order, we have the things to tie back to. We're going in, we create the sales order, we note what sales order number it was, how many we ordered, sales price, and the data item and the value is all, again, dependent upon your own business requirements. This is just an example of what we do. The key things to note is that at each one you want to highlight, such as this: test email of sales order acknowledgement, test the print of the sales order acknowledgement. Make sure your test processes include printing the forms that they normally do. If you're adding email functionality and you hadn't had it before because now it's available in 10, test it here. Make sure it is done, which is why you have a note up above, though, there in the customer master. And while we start with looking at that first, we want to make sure we update the customer master to an internal email address so we don't go sending our best customer a fake order confirmation and they start calling us and asking what's going on. You also want to make sure you keep your processes in place. So if you are using MRP, include that step in here so we're actually seeing some generation of it. But control the volume. And when I say control the volume, part of the steps that we're doing back here when we're looking at the method of manufacturing and going through the MOM to the method tracker, we're getting that parts list of what's involved in the build. And we're going in and we want to control that we need to order some parts, but we don't need to order everything. And the whole reason for doing that is not to defeat the test, but to make sure the test is accomplishable in a reasonable time frame. If your BOM is 35 parts and every one of them comes up that needs to be ordered and inventory created for it, it's going to take a little bit longer to create all those POs and go through all that process steps. So bring it down to one item that's, needed to be purchased to stock, maybe one item that's purchased direct to job. If you do that, control the data so you are executing the business transactions you use, but on a smaller scale so I can document it, I can track it and make sure it went through. And the other thing we recommend is using your test log as a document repository or having it point to a share file. So we don't just print the sales order acknowledgement, we don't just email that sales order acknowledgement. All these things get printed off to PDF and stored in the same place that this conference room pilot test log is being maintained. Excuse me. The upgrade preparation, moving into the next steps. So we highly recommend that you process the upgrade multiple times, at least twice if possible. And this just helps you, and you'll see it in, again, coming to some of our detailed scenarios a little bit later on. This is going to help you do that time estimate. What's the upgrade weekend look like? When should I start to be finished at the time I need to be done to hand the system back to the business users? How long do I have to tell the business users the system will be unavailable? If you do have people that work on the weekends, etc., you want to tell them what the outage time is so they're not trying to come into it. So in that first conversion, you're setting up the development instance. That's where your team that is doing the development should start doing all the customizations, the enhancements, the form changes, and everything else, setting it up for first the Epicor team's unit testing and then handing it over for unit testing by the users before we get to our conference room pilot. That's also, after we've done that, we do all these modifications. As we're moving these solution packs that are coming out from the upgrade customizations and everything else that we're doing, we want to time them. We want to note what the solution pack is, how it's stored, where it's stored, size, time to migrate it, time to apply it, any manual changes that went through to accompany it. That's all leading up to, ideally, if you can, and the project timeline allows it, we want to go through the conversion again. So before we do move into user acceptance testing, we actually reset the instance back and go through all the upgrade steps again. This is going to help you actually truly fine-tune the conversion weekend log that you want to create, your action list, whatever you'd like to call it, your mini project plan for that weekend that says we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, step by step by step with notifications. You'll see the example in a minute. But it also helps you get those timings right. Like I said before, we want to be able to set up how long will the system be offline, how long do I expect this to take. Going through this process using the solution packs that have already been built, now you've got a good, accurate timeline that I can work to and be comfortable that as I'm communicating this to the end user community, as I'm communicating it to my upgrade team, that this is when I'm going to expect them to be available on the weekend to do this activity. Some recommendations for the upgrade weekend itself. Start the upgrade as soon as possible on Friday. Ideally, most people end at 5 o'clock. If there's a way that we can start at 12, anything we can do to start earlier will help you. And the reason I mention this is we have always done our projects that we start on Friday. We will work Friday night, Saturday morning, whatever it takes. We want to be done with the upgrade on Saturday. We want to be at that point where we're ready to look at audit reports and validation on Saturday. And that provides a buffer that if for some reason there is a problem, I can re-execute it again starting on Saturday, still finish on Sunday, and still hand over an upgraded system to my end user community who's expecting it on Monday, and I still met my commitments to my business and to my management team. So that's why we do that. We also include in our templates and our recommendations that you use audit reports. And we recommend using standard audit reports for the audit process. We don't use custom reports. Custom reports have a tendency to cause problems in the validation of the system. Part of what you're trying to do is identify was there any data loss or any data corruption, which shouldn't happen, but we want to put those safety measures in place to make sure we've checked and we can provide documentation and auditing that says we did check and we didn't lose anything. So using the standard stock status report, I have $1.2 million of inventory in my legacy system. I go through the conversion, I run that same stock status report, I have 1.2 million. Again, we print them, we store the PDF, we put it on the document repository. The reason why we want to use standard reports is there's two things wrong with, or potentially wrong with, using a custom report for this validation process. One, it's a custom report. As we said, everything has to be rewritten. If it was rewritten improperly, you could get $1.5 million on that custom status report, but it's because it's using the wrong costing data. It's using the wrong quantity data. So you want to compare apples to apples. The other thing that you want to do, and the reason why we use standard reports, is the secondary audit happens before you apply your customizations and enhancements. Sometimes that application of customizations, enhancements, forms, and everything else can take a few hours, and we want to minimize that time, like I talked about earlier, that if I have a data corruption issue or I had something fall through the cracks, I want to restart as soon as possible. So I'd rather keep those 4 hours for myself if I have to restart. So we always recommend run the audit reports before you apply any customizations, and it becomes a status meeting, it becomes a go, no-go decision for that one. Okay? Basically, control it. Make sure it's a step-by-step process. You have everything noted properly so that you're ready if you have to repeat it on Sunday, or you have Sunday off and you're looking forward to a worry-free Monday. This is an example of what we use for our conversion weekend process. And I'm not going to go through line by line, but you can see we try to put as much detail as possible in here. What needs to be happening, completion of the business activity, locking the users, release the exception list of users, that's your Epicor core team, all the things that we've had happen over the years as far as, oh, make sure all these groups are cleared. Hey, you need to run this conversion. So every time we've done this, this list is updated if anything we run into and go through it. And I know I'm getting a little close on time, so I won't go through too much detail, but you can see in here we have the audit reports. And we actually have a different tab, which we didn't show on here, which shows what we recommend for the details of the audit reports to run. But you're doing those pre and post the upgrade. Take that snapshot on the legacy environment before it happens. We compare that snapshot afterwards. The other thing that is not called out in this one is based on the timing, and there's usually right after we import and assign the license files. As you can see, this project right now, the conversion was finishing somewhere about 3:40, 4 in the morning. So we put our first status meeting regarding that until the next morning. There was no reason to wake people up at 4 in the morning. We waited until 7 in the morning to have that status call. But there's also always status calls embedded in the project plan based on where you want them to be, that are the whole team coming together. Have we done this? Have we posted and deleted all the AR groups? Are we ready? So that first one's going to be before the systems engineer logs on and shuts down the servers and begins the upgrade process. Typically, you would have a stop meeting right then and there, right in between those two steps. And we get together on a conference call. Make sure, have we done the audits? Have we done the group notifications? Do we have the proof? Someone else will do some spot checks. Go look for the audit reports on the shared server. Maybe pull up a couple of groups and make sure they're all empty. We'll be doing that too if we're working with you. We're going to run those same tests ourselves as the project is going on. Right. Wrapping up the justification for the upgrade. As we talked about before, it's going to be different and unique for each business case. There's lots of reasons to upgrade. Right now what we're doing is just some common elements here that we're seeing pretty much across the board for everybody. The biggest one is performance. So Epicor's put a lot of effort on standardizing on the .NET framework, and also they've removed that open edge application layer. The result is a great increase in performance. We're seeing it everywhere. We've had lots of feedback, very positive about the performance. We've had one customer that did report some performance downgrade, and that was actually for users that it turned out were offshore, were coming in through a less than favorable internet connection, I guess would be the politest way to put it. So as a rule, we're seeing everything working much faster, much quicker, on, in some cases, even a smaller hardware platform, or sizing exactly to what you have now. Actually, your hardware platform is going to go much longer as far as it, just because the performance is not going to degrade, which is typically one of the reasons you see with a requirement for a hardware upgrade is degradation in performance, running out of disk space, running out of memory unless you're in a virtualized environment. Another one we have is the administration process. Epicor's moved a lot of the console elements, a lot of elements that were outside. They're now inside the administration console, the help, the education, the performance tuning. The overall is it's just a easier to maintain, easier to monitor, easier to use, easier to navigate system with all the things that they've built up onto it. Right. The other one is obviously functionality, and this is a list. There's bigger lists, there's documentation, so we've kind of just put some of the things that we find are some nice ones that we've had a lot of success with as far as customers really working well with them. And I'm not going to read them all off to you. We'll be sending this out to everyone that's attended in it so you can take a look at it yourself. But planning contracts, zero quantity items. There's obviously on Epic Web, there's a whole list of what's been new in the 10s. And if you want, we also have our own summarized version that's a little less technical and maybe a little more summarized if you'd like to take a look at that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up and turn it over to Mr. Burns.
Great, thanks, Steve. We have had a bunch of questions come in, but before we do, I'll put up the second poll, the last poll of the day, and it's really for understanding time frames as far as when you're planning to upgrade. So I'll leave that up. Maybe we'll field a few questions for Mr. Carr here. The first one, Steve, how long does the upgrade usually take?
Sorry, I wanted to drink up that. Normally what I would allocate is for a medium amount of customizations and enhancements, I would recommend a project timeline that's 6 to 8 weeks. That's typically what we see. Okay. And that's going to allow enough time for processing and reprocessing the upgrades, customizations, enhancements, getting them done and tested properly, and also give your user community that 1 to 2 weeks of testing that they should do to validate the system.
Great. Another good question. What's the most time-consuming aspect of the upgrade?
Same thing we've been talking a lot about, the customizations and all of that. Because everything needs to be opened, reviewed, and at a minimum the database names updated, that usually is just the sheer hours and effort there is probably the longest time. Maybe not the most costliest, but the longest in duration.
Great. Another good one. What have customers said they like most about Epicor ERP 10?
Definitely the performance. We've got a lot of feedback on the performance and on some of the new features like I talked about with the planning functionality. Definitely a lot of excellent feedback on the enterprise search. If you're not using that now and you enable it with 10, enterprise search, Google for your ERP system, it's fantastic. And with the new structure, you don't need to do a replication server, so it's easier and not as costly to implement. And my own personal favorite is the menu search. I think that's a blast because I don't have to remember where things are on the menu tree anymore and go try to remember where is serial number maintenance, even though you're not supposed to use that. I can just type it in the search button and it pops up for me.
Great, thanks. Time for one more. Can you upgrade directly to ERP 10 from a legacy version such as Vista?
Coming from a Vista or a Vantage system, they're actually, you can and you can't. And I say that with a caveat because you can upgrade directly, but there are pit stops that the system must take on the way. So if you're on a less than 803, whatever the current release is, I don't remember off the top of my head, of Vista or Vantage, we're going to have to bring your system up to that point, and then we have to bring it to the 9, and then we can bring it to the 10. And so that does require a 803 if you're not on the most current one instance setup, and a 9-something instance setup, and then your internal server would be the production server. The good news is for our customers, because we do maintain running instances of all versions that we have access to, of Vista, Vantage, Epicor 9, and Epicor 10, we can remove that out of their cost and their budget requirements by taking their database to our local servers here, bringing it up to the 803, bringing it up to the 9 release it needs to be, then we put it back down the customer system and run the final upgrade on their 10 instance there.
Perfect, thanks. Well, thank you everybody. On behalf of Steve Carr and all the employees at Crawford Software, I want to thank you for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed today's webinar. And please join us for our next webinar coming up on Wednesday, August 23rd at noon Eastern, when we'll give an overview of Epicor's product configurator. You can register on our website at www.crawford-software.com or look for an upcoming email invitation. Thank you again and have a great day.